When my influencer neighbors decided my apartment didn't match their curated aesthetic, they launched a full campaign to push me out. They posted viral content mocking my place, as in filed complaints with the landlord demanding my eviction, and even staged fake before and after shots to make their case stronger. I'm just a regular guy who keeps his place clean but not Instagram perfect, and suddenly I was the villain in their manufactured drama. But when I fought back with evidence of their harassment campaign, the housing authority hit them with a $15,000 penalty for discriminatory behavior. Sometimes standing up to bullies pays off in ways you never expect. So I'm Ryan, 30, freelance photographer. I spend most of my time working from my home office, editing photos and managing client projects. My apartment isn't fancy, but it's comfortable and functional for what I need. I live in this decent complex downtown where most people keep to themselves. The building has this mix of young professionals, retirees, and a few families. Generally, everyone gets along fine and respects each other's space. About 6 months ago, these two influencers moved into the unit next to mine. Madison and Trevor, both in their mid-20s, with perfectly styled everything and ring lights constantly going in their windows. They do lifestyle content and home decor stuff, always filming themselves cooking elaborate meals or rearranging furniture. At first, I thought they seemed nice enough. Madison introduced herself when I was checking mail and mentioned they were content creators. I told them I was a photographer, and we had this brief conversation about cameras and lighting setups. But things started getting weird pretty quickly. I noticed them looking at my balcony whenever they were outside, and Madison made a few comments about how the building's aesthetic was so important for their brand. I didn't think much of it initially since my place looks normal to me. My balcony has some basic outdoor furniture, and I keep my photography equipment cases out there sometimes when I'm switching between shoots. Nothing messy or inappropriate, just practical stuff for someone who works from home. I keep everything organized and clean, but it's definitely not the minimalist white and beige setup they have going on next door. I was heading back from the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon when I ran into Madison and Trevor in the hallway. They were both dressed like they'd just finished filming something, with Madison in this perfectly coordinated outfit and Trevor carrying professional lighting equipment. Madison stopped me before I could get to my door and told me they wanted to chat about something important. She had this weird smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and Trevor was standing behind her nodding along like they'd rehearsed this conversation. She started by saying how much they loved living in the building and how great the community was. Then she mentioned that they'd been getting comments from their followers about the building's overall aesthetic in their content. I was confused about where this was going, so I just listened. Trevor jumped in and explained that their apartment faced the courtyard, and sometimes my balcony was visible in the background of their shots. He said it wasn't a big deal, but their audience had started noticing the contrast between their curated space and what he called the look of other units. I felt my stomach drop a little because I realized they were talking about my place specifically. Madison quickly added that she wasn't criticizing how I lived, but wondered if I'd considered updating my outdoor setup to something more cohesive with the building's vibe. I told them I kept everything clean and organized, and asked what exactly they thought needed changing. Madison got a little flustered and said it wasn't about cleanliness, more about the overall visual impact. She mentioned that having photography cases and practical furniture visible might not align with the aesthetic they were trying to maintain. Trevor suggested I might want to consider storing my equipment inside, or maybe investing in some pieces that would photograph better. He said they'd be happy to recommend some brands that would work well with the building's color scheme. I was honestly shocked that they thought they could dictate how I arranged my own balcony. I told them I needed the outdoor space for my work and wasn't planning to redecorate based on their filming needs. The conversation got more uncomfortable when Madison mentioned that several other residents had apparently commented about maintaining property values and the building's reputation. She said everyone wanted to keep the complex looking its best, especially since so many people were seeing it online now. I asked her directly which residents had complained, because I'd never had any issues with anyone else. She got vague and said it had come up in casual conversations, but couldn't give me specifics. Trevor then made this comment about how maybe I'd be happier in a building that was more suited to my lifestyle. He said it with this fake concerned tone, like he was doing me a favor by suggesting I move somewhere else. That's when I realized they weren't just asking me to change my balcony setup. They were actually hinting that I should leave the building entirely because my apartment didn't fit their brand image. I told them I wasn't moving and that I had every right to use my balcony, however I wanted, as long as I wasn't violating any lease terms. Madison's fake smile finally dropped, and she said they were just trying to be neighborly by bringing it to my attention. The whole interaction left me feeling angry and confused. I'd been living there for 3 years without any problems, and suddenly these people who'd been there 6 months were telling me my home wasn't good enough for their social media presence. A few days later, I was scrolling through Instagram during a work break when I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of my photography clients had tagged me in a story, asking if I'd seen the viral post about my building. I clicked through and found this video Madison had posted with over 50,000 views. The caption read something about living your authentic life despite challenging circumstances and not letting your environment define your standards. The video showed Madison on her perfectly styled balcony, talking about maintaining your personal aesthetic even when your surroundings aren't ideal. Then the camera panned to show my balcony in the background, with my equipment cases and regular outdoor furniture clearly visible. She never mentioned me by name, but she kept referring to how some people let their spaces become cluttered and how that energy can affect an entire community. The comments were brutal, with people calling my setup an eyesore and making jokes about inconsiderate neighbors. What made it worse was that she'd tagged the location of our building, so anyone could figure out exactly where this was happening. Several comments specifically mentioned the contrast between her beautiful space and the mess next door. I felt sick reading through the responses. People were analyzing my balcony like it was some kind of design disaster, when it's just a normal outdoor space where I keep my work equipment. Some commenters even suggested that buildings should have aesthetic standards for all residents. Trevor had shared the video to his own account with additional commentary about how your living environment reflects your mindset. He talked about choosing to surround yourself with beauty and intention, even when others around you haven't made that same choice. I took screenshots of everything because I had a feeling this wasn't going to end here. The video was getting shared across different platforms, and I could see people in the comments trying to figure out which apartment was mine. That evening, I ran into Mrs. Chun from down the hall, and she mentioned that she'd seen something online about our building. She asked if I knew anything about it, and I realized the video was spreading beyond just Madison and Trevor's followers. I spent the next few hours going through their other recent posts and found several more subtle references to dealing with difficult neighbors and maintaining your standards in challenging environments. They'd basically turned my existence into content for their brand. The worst part was seeing how their followers were eating it up. People were praising them for handling the situation with such grace and positivity. They were getting sympathy and engagement by essentially bullying me in public. I tried to report the posts for harassment, but the platforms didn't see anything that violated their community guidelines since they hadn't used my name or directly threatened me. It was just subtle enough to avoid consequences while still making their point clear. I called my friend Jake, who works in social media marketing, and told him what was happening. He looked up the posts and confirmed that they were definitely targeting me, even if they were being clever about how they did it. Jake told me this kind of thing was becoming more common, where influencers would manufacture drama with regular people to create engaging content. He said the best thing to do was document everything and avoid engaging directly with their posts. But I was furious that they thought they could use me as a prop in their online narrative without any consequences. They were making money off content that portrayed me as some kind of problem neighbor, when all I'd done was exist in my own apartment. The following Monday, I got a call from my landlord's office asking me to come in for a meeting that afternoon. The property manager, Linda, said there had been some concerns raised about my unit and she wanted to discuss them in person. I had a sinking feeling this was connected to Madison and Trevor's campaign, but I hoped maybe it was just routine maintenance stuff. I gathered up my lease documents and headed over to the management office. Linda was professional but seemed uncomfortable when I sat down across from her desk. She told me that they'd received several complaints about my apartment over the past week, specifically regarding the appearance of my balcony and its impact on other residents. I asked her who had complained and what specifically they were objecting to. She pulled out a folder and showed me printed emails that had been sent to the management company. The first email was from Madison, written in this very formal tone that was completely different from how she normally talked. She expressed concern about maintaining property values and mentioned that my balcony setup was creating visual pollution that affected other residents' enjoyment of their homes. Trevor had sent a separate email with photos attached, showing my balcony from different angles. He'd written this long explanation about how the building's aesthetic standards were being compromised and how it was impacting the community atmosphere. What really shocked me was seeing a third email from someone I'd never heard of, claiming to represent multiple concerned residents. This person demanded that management take immediate action to address what they called a serious violation of community standards. Linda told me she was required to investigate all resident complaints, but she seemed skeptical about the whole situation. She asked me to explain my perspective on what was happening. I told her about the hallway conversation with Madison and Trevor and showed her screenshots of their viral posts targeting my apartment. I explained that I'd been living there for 3 years without any previous complaints, and that this all started after I refused to redecorate my balcony to match their aesthetic preferences. Linda looked through the screenshots on my phone and her expression changed. She told me she hadn't realized there was a social media component to the complaints, and that put things in a different light. I asked her directly if the management company was planning to take any action based on these emails. She said they were still reviewing the situation, but wanted to hear my side before making any decisions. Then she showed me something that made my heart race. There was another email, this one demanding that management begin eviction proceedings against me for violating community standards and creating a hostile living environment for other residents. The email was written like a legal document, citing specific clauses in the lease agreement about maintaining property appearance and not interfering with other residents' peaceful enjoyment of their homes. It claimed that my refusal to address the situation constituted a pattern of disruptive behavior. Linda told me that while she didn't think the complaints had legal merit, the management company had to take them seriously because of potential liability issues. She said they were consulting with their legal team about how to proceed. I felt panic starting to set in because I realized Madison and Trevor weren't just harassing me online. They were actively trying to get me evicted from my home using official channels. Linda seemed sympathetic to my situation, but explained that her hands were tied by company policy. She said I should document everything and be prepared to present my case if this escalated further. As I was leaving her office, she mentioned off the record that she'd noticed an unusual pattern in the complaints, with multiple emails arriving within a short time frame and using similar language. She suggested I might want to look into whether this was a coordinated effort. That comment confirmed what I'd already suspected. Madison and Trevor weren't just complaining as individuals. They were organizing some kind of campaign to force me out of my apartment. I decided I needed to gather evidence of what was really happening, so I started spending more time in the common areas of the building. I wanted to see if Madison and Trevor were actually talking to other residents about me, or if they were manufacturing the complaints themselves. That weekend, I was sitting in the courtyard reading when I noticed Madison and Trevor setting up what looked like a photo shoot near the building's entrance. They had professional lighting equipment and were taking turns posing in different outfits. I stayed where I was and tried to look casual while keeping an eye on what they were doing. They seemed to be creating content about their building and neighborhood, with Madison talking to the camera about finding beauty in urban living. After about an hour, I saw them move their setup to a different angle where my balcony would be visible in the background. Madison started filming again, this time talking about the challenges of maintaining your personal aesthetic when you can't control your entire environment. That's when I realized they were creating more content that would subtly target my apartment. I pulled out my phone and started recording from where I was sitting, making sure to capture what they were doing. The really disturbing part came when they started staging what looked like before and after shots. Trevor positioned himself to block the view of my balcony in some shots, while other photos deliberately included it as a contrast to their perfect setup. I watched Madison direct Trevor to move their furniture around to create different looks, and she kept checking how my balcony appeared in the frame. They were clearly using my space as a prop in their content without my knowledge or consent. My friend Jake happened to call while I was watching all this, and I told him what was happening in real time. He told me to keep recording and to make sure I captured them deliberately framing my apartment in their shots. Jake drove over and arrived just as Madison and Trevor were wrapping up their photo session. I introduced him as my friend who worked in marketing, and he started making casual conversation with them about their content creation process. Madison seemed excited to talk about their work and started explaining their concept for the shoot. She mentioned how they were documenting the reality of urban living and the importance of creating beauty wherever you are. Jake asked some technical questions about their setup and complimented their lighting choices. While they were distracted talking to him, I was able to get better video footage of their equipment positioning and the angles they'd been using. Then Jake made this brilliant move where he asked if they ever had issues with neighbors complaining about their filming. Madison immediately launched into this story about how most people were supportive, but sometimes you encounter residents who don't understand the creative process. She said some people get defensive when they realize their lifestyle choices might not photograph well, and that it created tension in the community. Trevor added that they always tried to be respectful, but couldn't compromise their artistic vision for people who weren't willing to make an effort. Jake recorded this entire conversation on his phone, capturing them essentially admitting that they were targeting me because my apartment didn't fit their aesthetic standards. They had no idea they were providing evidence for the harassment case I was building. After they left, Jake and I reviewed all the footage we'd captured. The video clearly showed them deliberately positioning their shots to include my balcony, staging multiple setups that used my space as a negative contrast to their content. Jake told me this was exactly the kind of evidence I'd need to prove they were systematically harassing me. He said the combination of their social media posts, the coordinated complaints to management, and now this stage photo shoot showed a clear pattern of targeted behavior. Back in my apartment that evening, I spread out all the evidence I'd collected on my dining room table. I had screenshots of their viral posts, copies of the emails they'd sent to management, and the video footage from that afternoon's stage photo shoot. Looking at everything together, I could see the full scope of what Madison and Trevor were doing. They'd created a systematic campaign to force me out of my home because my apartment didn't match their brand aesthetic. I felt overwhelmed by the situation, but also angry that they thought they could manipulate the system to get rid of me. I'd been living peacefully in my apartment for 3 years, and suddenly these people were trying to destroy my housing stability for social media content. Jake had sent me some research about tenant rights and housing discrimination. He'd found information about harassment based on lifestyle differences and how social media could be used as evidence in housing disputes. I started drafting a formal complaint to submit to the city's housing authority. The process required detailed documentation of the harassment pattern, including dates, specific incidents, and evidence of discriminatory behavior. Writing everything out made me realize how extensive their campaign had become. It wasn't just casual complaints or social media drama. They were actively trying to damage my reputation with management and create grounds for my eviction. The hardest part was acknowledging how much this was affecting my daily life. I'd started avoiding my balcony because I knew they might be filming, and I felt anxious every time I saw them in the hallway or common areas. I called my sister Emma, who works as a paralegal, and asked her to review my documentation. She told me I had a strong case for harassment and that the housing authority took these kinds of complaints seriously. Emma helped me organize the evidence chronologically and suggested additional documentation I should gather. She recommended I also file complaints with the social media platforms and keep records of any future incidents. The most important thing she told me was that I needed to be proactive about protecting myself. Madison and Trevor had already escalated to involving management, so I needed to get ahead of their next moves. I spent the next few hours preparing a comprehensive evidence package that included printed screenshots, email copies, video files, and a detailed timeline of events. Emma had given me templates for formal complaints that would present everything in the most professional way possible. As I was finishing up the paperwork, I got a text from Mrs. Chin asking if everything was okay. She said she'd noticed some tension in the building lately and wanted to make sure I wasn't having any problems. I realized that other residents were starting to pick up on the conflict, which meant Madison and Trevor's campaign was affecting the entire community atmosphere. That gave me additional motivation to fight back through official channels. Before going to bed, I double-checked that all my evidence was properly organized and backed up. I knew that once I filed the formal complaint, this situation would escalate significantly. But I also knew I couldn't let them succeed in forcing me out of my home. If I didn't stand up for myself now, they'd learn they could bully anyone who didn't fit their curated lifestyle standards. The Housing Authority hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 p.m. I arrived early and sat in the waiting area, going over my notes one more time while trying to calm my nerves. Madison and Trevor showed up about 10 minutes before the hearing was supposed to start. They were dressed professionally and seemed confident, chatting quietly with each other while occasionally glancing in my direction. The hearing officer, Ms. Rodriguez, called us into a small conference room and explained the process. She said I'd have the opportunity to present my complaint first, followed by their response, and then she'd ask questions before making a determination. I started by explaining the timeline of events, beginning with the hallway conversation where Madison and Trevor first suggested I should move out of the building. Ms. Rodriguez took notes as I described how they'd escalated from direct confrontation to social media harassment. When I showed her the screenshots of their viral posts, I could see her expression change. She asked me to explain how the posts connected to my apartment specifically, and I walked her through the location tags and visual references that made it clear they were targeting me. Madison interrupted to say that their content was about general lifestyle inspiration and wasn't intended to target any individual. She claimed they had every right to share their own experiences and perspectives about urban living. Ms. Rodriguez asked Madison to wait her turn and let me finish presenting my case. I continued with the emails they'd sent to building management, showing how they'd coordinated multiple complaints designed to create grounds for my eviction. The most impactful evidence was the video footage Jake and I had captured of them staging photo shoots that deliberately included my balcony as a negative contrast. Ms. Rodriguez watched the entire video and asked several clarifying questions about when and where it was recorded. Trevor tried to dismiss the video by saying they were just creating content in public areas and couldn't control what appeared in the background. He claimed they had no intention of targeting my apartment specifically. But then Ms. Rodriguez played the audio portion where Madison and Trevor discussed dealing with neighbors who don't understand the creative process. Their own words contradicted their claims about not targeting me personally. When it was their turn to present their side, Madison and Trevor tried to frame the situation as a simple neighbor dispute about property maintenance. They claimed they'd only contacted management because other residents had expressed concerns about building aesthetics. Ms. Rodriguez asked them to provide evidence of these other resident complaints. They couldn't produce any documentation or witness statements to support their claims about widespread community concerns. Trevor attempted to argue that my photography equipment created safety hazards and violated lease terms about balcony usage. But when Ms. Rodriguez asked for specific lease violations, he couldn't cite any actual policy I'd broken. Madison tried a different approach, claiming that their social media posts were protected speech and that I was trying to censor their content. She said they shouldn't be penalized for sharing their authentic experiences about urban living challenges. Ms. Rodriguez pointed out that the issue wasn't their right to create content, but their pattern of using that content to harass a specific neighbor. She asked them directly whether they'd coordinated their complaints to management with the goal of forcing my eviction. Both Madison and Trevor denied any coordination, but the timeline of their emails and social media posts made their claims implausible. Ms. Rodriguez noted that their actions showed clear intent to create hostile living conditions for me. The hearing lasted about 2 hours, with Ms. Rodriguez asking detailed questions about each piece of evidence. She seemed particularly interested in the fake resident complaints and the staged photo shoots that used my apartment as a prop. At the end of the hearing, Ms. Rodriguez said she'd review all the evidence and issue a written determination within 10 business days. She warned all parties that retaliation or continued harassment could result in additional penalties. I got the call from Ms. Rodriguez exactly 1 week later. She told me the housing authority had found sufficient evidence to support my harassment complaint and would be issuing penalties against Madison and Trevor. The written determination arrived by email that afternoon, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. The housing authority had fined Madison and Trevor $15,000 total for discriminatory harassment based on lifestyle differences and coordinated efforts to interfere with my housing rights. The report detailed how their social media campaign, false complaints to management, and staged photo shoots constituted a pattern of harassment designed to force me from my home. Ms. Rodriguez had specifically noted that using social media to target a neighbor's living situation crossed the line from free speech into harassment territory. Within hours of receiving the determination, I noticed that Madison and Trevor had deleted all their posts that referenced our building or showed my balcony. They'd also posted new content about focusing on positivity and moving forward from negative situations. Jake called me that evening after seeing the news, and he was more excited than I was. He told me the $15,000 fine was significant and would send a message to other influencers who thought they could bully regular people for content. But the victory felt complicated because I still had to live in the same building as Madison and Trevor. The housing authority had ordered them to cease all harassment, but I wasn't sure how that would play out in daily interactions. I ran into Madison in the lobby the next day, and the encounter was incredibly awkward. She avoided eye contact and quickly got on the elevator without acknowledging me. It was clear that the professional confidence she'd shown at the hearing had evaporated. My landlord's office called to let me know they'd received a copy of the housing authority determination and were closing their investigation into the complaints against me. Linda told me the management company would be more careful about evaluating resident complaints in the future. The story started spreading on social media after someone posted about the housing authority decision on a local community forum. People were sharing it as an example of influencer culture gone wrong and the importance of tenant rights. I got messages from several neighbors expressing support and apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Mrs. Chin told me she'd suspected something was wrong, but hadn't wanted to get involved in what seemed like a personal dispute. Trevor posted a vague apology on his social media accounts about learning from mistakes and being more mindful of how their content affected others. But he never mentioned me specifically or acknowledged the harassment campaign they conducted. Madison went completely quiet on social media for several weeks, which was unusual for someone who normally posted daily content. When she finally returned, her posts were much more generic and didn't include any location tags or building references. The $15,000 fine apparently hit them hard financially, based on some subtle references in their content about unexpected expenses and having to adjust their lifestyle. I felt a little bad about the financial impact, but reminded myself that they'd brought it on themselves. What surprised me most was hearing from other people who'd experienced similar harassment from social media influencers. Several people reached out to share their own stories about neighbors or community members who tried to force them to change their lifestyle to match someone else's aesthetic standards. Life in the building settled into a new normal over the following weeks, but the atmosphere remained tense. Madison and Trevor kept to themselves and avoided any interaction with me, which was actually a relief after months of feeling like I was being watched and judged. Other residents seemed to be walking on eggshells around the situation. Some people were clearly on my side and made supportive comments when they saw me, while others seemed uncomfortable with the whole conflict and just wanted things to go back to normal. The building management sent out a memo to all residents about community standards and respectful neighbor relations. It didn't mention our situation specifically, but everyone knew what had prompted the reminder about treating fellow residents with courtesy and respect. I noticed that Madison and Trevor had significantly reduced their filming activities in common areas. They still created content, but they were much more careful about where and how they shot their videos and photos. My own daily routine gradually returned to normal, though I remained more aware of my surroundings and documented any interactions with them. The housing authority had warned that any retaliation or continued harassment could result in additional penalties. Jake suggested I write about my experience on Reddit to help other people who might be dealing with similar situations. He thought my story could be useful for people trying to understand their rights when facing harassment from neighbors or social media influencers. I was hesitant at first because I didn't want to reignite the conflict, but I realized that sharing my experience might help other people recognize harassment patterns and know how to respond effectively. The Reddit post got a lot of attention, with people sharing their own stories about influencer neighbors and lifestyle harassment. Many commenters thanked me for fighting back and setting a precedent that regular people don't have to tolerate being used as props in someone else's content. Several people asked for advice about documenting harassment and filing complaints with housing authorities. I was glad I could provide practical information based on what I'd learned through the process. The most interesting responses came from other content creators who condemned Madison and Trevor's behavior and emphasized that responsible influencers don't target unwilling neighbors for their content. They said the situation gave the entire industry a bad reputation. A few months later, I heard through building gossip that Madison and Trevor were planning to move out when their lease expired. Apparently, the fine and negative publicity had damaged their brand enough that they wanted a fresh start somewhere else. I felt mixed emotions about them leaving. Part of me was relieved that the source of conflict would be gone, but I also felt like I'd won the right to stay in my home and shouldn't have to see them driven away. Mrs. Chin mentioned that she'd learned a lot from watching how the situation played out. She said she'd speak up sooner if she ever saw one resident trying to bully another, instead of assuming it was just a personal dispute that would resolve itself. 6 months after the housing authority hearing, I was sitting on my balcony editing photos when I reflected on everything that had happened. My outdoor space looked exactly the same as it had before Madison and Trevor moved in, but my relationship with it had changed completely. I no longer felt self-conscious about my practical furniture or photography equipment cases. The experience had taught me that I didn't need to justify my lifestyle choices to anyone, especially neighbors who were using me as content for their social media brand. The $15,000 fine had sent a clear message that harassment disguised as lifestyle content wouldn't be tolerated by housing authorities. I'd heard from other people who'd used my case as a precedent when filing their own complaints about neighbor harassment. What struck me most was how close I'd come to actually moving out during the worst part of the conflict. If I hadn't documented everything and fought back through official channels, Madison and Trevor might have succeeded in forcing me from my home. The experience had also shown me the importance of having supportive friends like Jake, who helped me gather evidence and navigate the complaint process. I probably wouldn't have known how to respond effectively without his guidance and encouragement. I'd learned to recognize the difference between normal neighbor disputes and systematic harassment campaigns. Madison and Trevor's behavior had crossed clear lines by involving social media, filing false complaints, and coordinating efforts to damage my housing stability. The building felt more peaceful now that they'd moved out, but I remained vigilant about protecting my rights as a tenant. I'd kept all the documentation from the case in case I ever needed to reference it or help someone else in a similar situation. My photography business had actually benefited from the experience in an unexpected way. Several clients had hired me after reading about the case online, saying they appreciated working with someone who stood up for their principles. I still got occasional messages from people dealing with influencer harassment, asking for advice about documentation and complaint processes. It felt good to help others navigate situations that I'd had to figure out on my own. The whole experience had reinforced my belief that regular people deserve to live their lives without being turned into content for someone else's brand. Social media influence doesn't give anyone the right to harass their neighbors or dictate community standards. Looking back, I was proud that I'd fought back instead of just accepting the harassment or moving away to avoid conflict. Standing up for myself had protected not just my housing rights, but my dignity and sense of belonging in my own home. Epilogue. It's been over a year now since the housing authority issued that $15,000 fine, and I'm still living in the same apartment with the same practical balcony setup. Madison and Trevor moved out as expected, and the new neighbors who took their unit are quiet professionals who keep to themselves. The building management has implemented clearer policies about resident complaints and social media harassment, partly because of what happened with my case. They now require more substantial evidence before investigating lifestyle-based complaints, which protects other residents from similar harassment campaigns. I occasionally get updates from people who've used my experience as a template for their own housing authority complaints. It's gratifying to know that fighting back helped establish protections for other people dealing with neighbor harassment. My relationship with social media has changed completely. I'm much more aware of how influencers can exploit regular people for content, and I'm careful about what personal information I share online. I also make sure to support content creators who treat their communities with respect rather than viewing them as props for their brand. The whole experience taught me that sometimes you have to fight for your right to exist as yourself, especially when dealing with people who see you as an obstacle to their curated lifestyle. Standing up to bullies isn't always easy, but it's often the only way to protect yourself and others from similar treatment.